The year is 1932. America is drowning in the depths of the Great Depression. The dream of prosperity, once a guiding star for millions of immigrants and a core tenet of national identity, has curdled into a nightmare of grinding poverty and pervasive despair. 25% of the workforce, millions of men and women, are unemployed. Their life savings evaporated as thousands of banks collapse, taking with them the meager holdings of ordinary families. Home ownership, once a symbol of security, has become a cruel irony. As houses are foreclosed at an alarming rate, their former occupants joining the swelling ranks of the homeless. Faith in the system, once an unshakable bedrock of American exceptionalism, is crumbling, replaced by a gnawing sense of betrayal and a desperate hunt for scapegoats. Shantytowns, grimly known as Hoovervilles, scar the landscape from the muddy banks of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C. to the sprawling emptiness of Central Park in New York. They are stark, cardboard and tin monuments to a broken promise where entire families huddle against the elements, scavenging for scraps. Farmers, once the backbone of the nation, watch their crops rot in the fields because prices have collapsed to unsellable levels. The devastating impact of the Dust Bowl is beginning its cruel sweep across the Great Plains, rendering vast tracts of farmland barren, forcing countless families from their blighted lands, driving them west in jalopies, only to find no solace, just more competition for ever scarcer jobs. A chilling sense of growing, simmering unrest permeates every corner of society, a volatile mix of hunger, anger, and a desperate plea for radical change. Suicide rates are soaring, malnutrition is rampant. The nation feels like a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. In Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, a desperate plea for justice arrives. Thousands of World War I veterans, the Bonus Army, march on the Capitol. These are the men who endured the horrors of the trenches in France, now fighting for survival on the streets of their own country. Their uniforms are tattered, their hopes worn thin. They demand immediate payment of the bonuses promised for their service, a mere pittance that could mean the difference between starvation and a glimmer of hope. In our timeline, President Hoover, besieged by crises, ordered the military to disperse them, a harsh action that further damaged his public image and paved the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt's landslide victory in the November election. FDR, with his New Deal, ultimately navigated the nation through this crisis, strengthening democracy. But what if, in that moment of extreme desperation and civil unrest, the economic and social fabric of the United States had completely unraveled? What if the Great Depression sparked a second American Civil War? Our point of divergence takes us to the sweltering summer of 1932, specifically to the Bonus Army incident. The tension is palpable. The veterans, many with families camped alongside them, refuse to leave. They are desperate, defiant, but fundamentally peaceful. President Hoover, surrounded by advisors who fear communist infiltration and a complete breakdown of order, gives orders to clear the encampments. However, General Douglas MacArthur, known for his ambition, his deep-seated anti-Bolshevism, and his rigid, forceful will, interprets these orders with an almost apocalyptic zeal. He sees not desperate veterans, but revolutionaries, a nascent threat to the very republic. Instead of merely dispersing the veterans with tear gas and a show of force, MacArthur deploys the full might of the U.S. Army units at his disposal. Not just infantry and cavalry, but M1917 light tanks and machine gun platoons. The clash is not a mere dispersal, it's a brutal, indiscriminate massacre. As tear gas canisters rain down, followed by cavalry charges, live ammunition is fired into the retreating crowds. Former soldiers, caught in the chaos, instinctively try to help women and children, only to be cut down. Hoovervilles, built of cardboard and scrap wood, are deliberately set ablaze, trapping families inside. The screams of the wounded mingle with the crackle of flames and the thunder of tank treads. Dozens, perhaps even hundreds of American veterans, their wives and children, are killed or grievously wounded. Among the casualties are decorated war heroes, pregnant women, and even infants. The Potomac River itself seems to run red with their blood. The images, captured by shocked photojournalists and whispered on radio waves for days, are sickening beyond belief. Photographs show tanks rolling over tents, cavalry trampling protesters, smoke billowing from the veterans' makeshift homes, and most horrifyingly, American soldiers firing on their own citizens, on men who once fought under the same flag. The nation reels in horror. Radio broadcasts are interrupted with desperate eyewitness accounts. The sight of this unprecedented violence, this profound betrayal of those who served, shocks the nation to its core. But this time, the outrage doesn't just spark political change, it ignites outright rebellion. The trust in the federal government, already tenuous, shatters completely. The Bonus Army crackdown becomes a national rallying cry, a potent symbol of government tyranny against its own people, proving that Washington, D.C. is no longer a beacon of democracy, but an oppressor. The question echoes across every town square and empty factory floor. If they'll do this to heroes, what will they do to us? The brutal suppression of the Bonus Army becomes the unignorable catalyst, the final straw for a populace already at its breaking point. The outrage is immediate and visceral, transforming public sympathy for the veterans into widespread, furious condemnation of the federal government. This isn't just discontent anymore. It's a call to arms, fueled by a potent mix of economic despair, moral indignation, and a thirst for vengeance. The illusion of a unified nation, already paper-thin, evaporates. Local sheriffs and National Guard units ordered to restore order often find themselves facing neighbors and family. Their resolve cracks, leading to mutinies or outright refusals to fire on fellow Americans. The initial federal attempts to suppress these burgeoning uprisings are woefully inadequate, scattered, and often meet with violent counterattacks, proving to the nascent factions that Washington is weak. Across the nation, the simmering cauldron of desperation boils over into organized resistance, drawing on existing social movements and grievances that had been festering for years. In the drought-stricken farmlands of the Midwest, where dust storms choke the sky and foreclosures are rampant, desperate farmers, already armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, begin to coalesce. They are tired of losing their land to banks, tired of seeing their families starve, while grain rots in the fields. Radical figures, like those advocating for debt moratoriums, outright land redistribution, or even the creation of a new greenback currency, find fertile ground for their revolutionary ideas. They organize into decentralized agrarian militia councils, swearing loyalty not to Washington, but to their communities and their survival. Their call is for a new kind of independence, one free from predatory banks, corrupt railroad companies, and distant federal mandates. They dream of self-sufficiency, of a return to a simpler, fairer, and often more isolationist way of life. They might adopt symbols of populist revolt, a raised fist clutching a sheaf of wheat, or a plain green banner symbolizing the people's currency. Their strength lies in their numbers, their intimate knowledge of the land, and their deep-seated resentment of urban elites. In the industrial heartlands of the Northeast, the Rust Belt, and the Great Lakes, millions of unemployed factory workers, living in squalid tenements and facing starvation, listen to the news of Washington's brutality with a cold fury. They see the Bonus Army as a reflection of their powerlessness, proof that the capitalist system values profit over people. Charismatic labor organizers, many with long-standing socialist, communist, or syndicalist leanings, gain unprecedented traction. They rally the dispossessed, arming them with whatever they can find. Salvaged tools from defunct factories, rusty firearms from pawn shops, even crudely manufactured Molotov cocktails and pipe bombs. These coalesce into well-organized workers' defense brigades and people's communes, seizing control of factories, vital infrastructure, and urban centers. Their demands are clear: immediate and complete ownership of the means of production, absolute workers' rights, and a violent end to capitalist exploitation. Cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago become fortresses of the proletariat, flying red banners of international socialism or the black flag of anarcho-syndicalism. They establish communal kitchens, worker-run councils, and people's courts, attempting to build a new society from the rubble of the old. Down south, among the impoverished sharecroppers, tenant farmers, and small landowners, the desperation is just as profound. But the ideological currents are often more complex and deeply rooted in regional history. Here, a potent blend of populism and traditionalism intertwines with a fervent desire for economic justice and a deep distrust of outsiders. Figures like Louisiana's Huey Long, with his electrifying Share Our Wealth program promising to make every man a king by heavily taxing the rich, becomes a messianic figure. His existing political machine, already paramilitary in nature, quickly transforms into a formidable fighting force, attracting both the genuinely desperate and opportunists. Similarly, the fiery radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, whose anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist rhetoric resonates deeply with a disillusioned populace, calls for a social justice that is eerily close to corporatism and fascism. His followers, already organized through local clubs, church congregations, and the National Union for Social Justice, swell his ranks. These forces coalesce into formidable populist armies, pledging fierce personal allegiance to their regional leaders and vowing to dismantle the corrupt system in Washington. The Ku Klux Klan, still a potent, violent force in many areas, would also find a new, terrifying purpose amidst the chaos, exploiting the breakdown of order to further its own racist and nativist agendas, adding another layer of horrific internal conflict within the Southern factions themselves, as Black Americans and other minorities fight for their own survival, sometimes forming their own armed self-defense groups. President Hoover's administration, already a lame duck and deeply unpopular, is utterly overwhelmed. The federal government, without the massive military and intelligence apparatus it would later develop for World War II and the Cold War, simply lacks the capacity to contain the spreading unrest. Its initial attempts to quell the rebellions are met with fierce, often surprising resistance. Federal troops, stretched thin and often sympathetic to the plight of the common American, face mass desertions and outright defections. Entire units, particularly those with strong regional ties, refuse orders or openly side with local populaces. The very chain of command begins to fray, with some officers openly questioning orders or establishing independent zones of control. As chaos spreads, key states, facing their own internal uprisings and the complete collapse of local law enforcement, declare states of emergency. They effectively secede from federal control, not over slavery as in the First Civil War, but over economic survival, deeply held ideologies, and a complete breakdown of trust in Washington. The United States begins to fracture along new complex lines. A shrinking federal core struggles to maintain control around Washington, D.C., and select loyalist coastal cities like Boston or parts of Virginia. Its authority is limited to military bases and what remains of loyalist enclaves. It represents the last vestiges of the old Union, but it is isolated, besieged, and struggling with internal dissent and dwindling resources. Its army, once the symbol of national unity, becomes a desperate fighting force trying to hold scattered positions, often engaging in desperate skirmishes for supplies. The agrarian republics of the South and Plains, driven by a powerful, populist, anti-bank, anti-Washington sentiment, sees a chance for true independence. Leaders like Huey Long, or newly emerging farm dictators in the Midwest, consolidate power. They implement radical land reforms, nationalize local banks, and demand an end to federal interference. Their armies are composed of battle-hardened farmers, familiar with the land and desperate to protect their homes, often employing guerrilla tactics perfected against federal revenue agents. They are fueled by a powerful, almost religious conviction in their cause, seeing themselves as rightful inheritors of the American spirit against corrupt industrial forces. The workers' communes of the industrial North, formed by powerful labor movements and socialist organizations, seize control of factories, infrastructure, and urban centers. They aim to establish a more equitable, worker-controlled society, but often descend into internal power struggles and brutal purges of class enemies or capitalist sympathizers. Their forces are industrial workers, many with combat experience from World War I, now turning their skills to urban warfare, constructing barricades, and turning factories into fortresses. They face not only federal resistance, but also internal challenges from various communist and anarchist factions vying for ultimate control. The Western independents, a more diverse and often less ideologically unified mix, emerge from the vastness of the American West. This could include libertarian-minded groups seeking isolation from the federal mess, powerful mining barons controlling vital resources, or states attempting to control their own destiny. Local warlords or powerful industrial magnates might emerge, controlling vast tracts of land and natural resources, leading to smaller, localized conflicts for mineral rights, water rights, and critical transportation routes. The sparse population makes large-scale conflict difficult, but isolated clashes are brutal, often involving heavily armed, self-sufficient communities. The 1932 election, which in our timeline brought Franklin D. Roosevelt to power with a mandate for change, is either never held successfully due to widespread violence, voter intimidation, and the collapse of infrastructure, or it is entirely invalidated by the spreading chaos. Franklin D. Roosevelt, a paralyzed figure who relied on the power of the federal government and his inspiring rhetoric to unite the nation, might never get the chance to implement the New Deal. Or if he wins, he inherits a nation already descending into armed conflict, facing not just an economic depression, but a civil war fought on new ideological and class lines. His efforts to unify would be met not with cooperation, but with bullets. The iconic fireside chats would be drowned out by machine gun fire and the sounds of distant explosions. His message of hope would be lost amidst the din of war. The violence would be widespread and brutal, unlike anything seen on American soil since the 1860s, and arguably far more chaotic and destructive. The lines between civilian and combatant blur quickly. Cities become cauldrons of fear and violence. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Pittsburgh would become savage battlegrounds. Their grand avenues would be choked with rubble, blood, and the cries of the wounded as rival factions fight for control of factories, transportation hubs, and food supplies. Urban warfare would be a nightmare of house-to-house fighting, ambushes from bombed-out buildings, and devastating civilian casualties. Snipers would pick off targets from rooftops, while improvised explosives, crudely fashioned from industrial chemicals or leftover WWI ordnance, would turn once bustling avenues into death traps. Electricity grids would fail, plunging vast urban areas into darkness and chaos for weeks or months at a time. Water and sewage systems would break down, leading to rampant disease like cholera and dysentery, adding to the death toll. Food riots would erupt, often leading to brutal suppression by the controlling faction. Regional militias, poorly trained but fiercely motivated by desperation and ideology, would clash with remnants of federal troops, or more often with each other. The conflict would be characterized by brutal guerrilla warfare, swift raids, and constantly shifting front lines. Ideological purges, summary executions of class enemies or federal agents, and localized terror would become commonplace as factions sought to consolidate power and eliminate dissent. Starvation would be a deliberate weapon of war. Blockades would prevent food from reaching enemy territories, leading to widespread famine in many areas as the already fragile food distribution system collapses. Grain would rot in one region, while people starved in another. Industrial production would grind to a halt. Factories, if not seized for war production, would be destroyed in fighting or lie dormant due to lack of materials, power, or manpower. This would plunge the nation into an even deeper economic abyss than the Depression itself, making recovery unimaginable. The concept of a unified American identity would shatter under the weight of internal conflict. Neighbors would turn on neighbors, fueled by desperation, ideology, and old grievances. Families would be torn apart by divided loyalties, brother fighting brother, father against son. The conflict would be less about defined front lines and more about a patchwork of contested territories, no man's lands, and isolated strongholds, where survival depended on who held the local power and what arbitrary rules they imposed. Travel between regions would become impossible, replaced by a patchwork of internal borders and armed checkpoints. Refugee crises would explode as millions attempt to flee the fighting, only to find few safe havens. Foreign powers watching from afar would not remain passive spectators. The United States, a rising global power in our timeline, would be seen as crippled, a ripe target for exploitation, and a massive power vacuum, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the 20th century. The United Kingdom and France, already struggling with their own economic woes and facing the terrifying rise of fascism in Europe, would be gravely concerned about the collapse of a major trading partner and debtor. They would covertly support the federal core with arms, financial aid, and intelligence, hoping to restore some semblance of order and protect their vast financial investments. But direct intervention would be risky, potentially dragging them into a quagmire far from their own shores. They might also begin to look elsewhere for trade and alliances, initiating a fundamental shift in global economic reliance, perhaps strengthening ties with their own empires or looking to the emerging powers of the Commonwealth. Loans to the federal core would be made with harsh conditions, extracting valuable concessions. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, would see this as a glorious validation of Marxist prophecy, the inevitable violent collapse of capitalism in its supposed strongest bastion. They would actively funnel massive amounts of propaganda, funds, and possibly even weapons and advisors to the workers' communes in the north, hoping to spark a true communist revolution in the heart of capitalism. Agents would infiltrate, offering tactical advice, ideological training, and help in establishing Soviet-style governance in controlled territories. This would lead to a bitter ideological proxy war on American soil, long before the term Cold War even existed, fundamentally altering the global spread of communism and giving the USSR an unprecedented ideological triumph. Imperial Japan, already aggressively expanding in East Asia, would see a golden opportunity to dominate the Pacific unchallenged. With the US Navy tightened up in domestic conflict, facing mutinies, or being used for internal riverine patrols, Japan could accelerate its territorial ambitions in China and Southeast Asia. They might seize US colonial possessions like the Philippines or Guam with little to no resistance. The attack on Pearl Harbor in this timeline might never happen, because there would be no strong US Pacific fleet to attack. This would fundamentally alter the balance of power in Asia, setting Japan on an even more aggressive and ultimately successful path to building its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, unchallenged by a unified America. Japanese naval and economic dominance in the Pacific would go unchecked, leading to a drastically different map of Asia. Perhaps even Nazi Germany, ascendant in Europe, would find immense inspiration in America's self-destruction. Hitler's propaganda would trumpet the collapse of democracy and capitalism, reinforcing his own totalitarian vision and demonstrating the weakness of democratic systems. Germany might also seek to destabilize neighboring countries in the Americas, or even establish direct economic and political influence in Latin America, unconstrained by a strong US. German businesses might look to exploit American resources in the chaos, perhaps even establishing direct trade routes with the Western independents or the agrarian republics seeking valuable raw materials. This could lead to a far more dangerous and powerful Third Reich. Other Latin American nations, wary of historic US interventionism, would seize the chance to assert greater independence, form stronger regional alliances, or even reclaim territories lost in previous conflicts. The Monroe Doctrine, a cornerstone of US foreign policy, would be dead, replaced by a scramble for influence and the rise of new regional powers. Some might even accept protection or aid from European or Asian powers, effectively becoming new proxy states in a global ideological struggle. Canada, too, would face an unprecedented refugee crisis and the looming threat of instability on its southern border, forcing it to militarize its own defenses. The long-term consequences would be catastrophic, shaping not only the former United States but the entire global landscape for decades, perhaps centuries. The economic recovery, already impossible during a civil war, would be set back by generations. Infrastructure would be decimated. Cities would lie in ruins. The national debt would soar to unimaginable levels, perhaps leading to hyperinflation and the complete collapse of the dollar, replacing it with a patchwork of regional currencies, or even a return to a barter system. The US, instead of emerging from World War II as a global superpower, would be a fragmented, war-torn collection of regional powers, its international influence negligible. Its vast resources, once a source of strength, would become a new source of internal conflict and external desire. The very idea of American democracy and unity would be irrevocably tainted by this devastating internal conflict. The land of the free would be remembered by the world as the land of fractured states, a cautionary tale of democracy's fragility. Generations would grow up knowing only division and conflict, their national identity tied to a regional faction rather than a unified nation. Travel and communication across former state lines would remain dangerous and infrequent. Education would be localized and politicized, teaching competing histories, fostering deeper regional animosities. The American dream would become a relic of a lost era. The potential for a subsequent world war, with no strong America to act as a deterrent or balancing force against aggressive, totalitarian regimes, would increase dramatically. The absence of US industrial might and leadership in the 1940s could lead to a very different outcome for the Second World War, perhaps a longer, bloodier conflict, or even an Axis victory that reshapes global geopolitics beyond recognition. The Cold War, as we know it, would never happen. Instead, the world might see a multipolar struggle for influence among a triumphant Soviet Union, a dominant Imperial Japan, and a stronger Nazi Germany with no democratic superpower to counter their ambitions. The democratic ideals that the US represented would be severely discredited on the world stage, and authoritarianism might become the dominant global political model. In this alternate history, the crucible of the Great Depression forges not a renewed, stronger union, but a fragmented, battling collection of states. It's a world where the spirit of American exceptionalism and unity buckles under the weight of economic despair and ideological extremism, leading to a dark, internal struggle whose echoes might last for centuries. The beacon of democracy, once a symbol of hope for oppressed peoples worldwide, would dim, leaving the world a much darker, more unpredictable place. The United States of America, as we know it, would cease to exist,